My name is Don Westfall. I'm with the Harpswell Heritage Land Trust. It's a privilege to be here on a steamy afternoon. The Schiller Center has graciously opened its doors for a number of programs in cooperation with HHLT. In a way, it's a natural alliance since the Land Trust's mission is to preserve and protect Harpswell's natural resources, cultural heritage, and access to the outdoors through the conservation, stewardship, and education. So I emphasize cultural heritage and education tonight. The Schiller Coastal Studies Center on Oars provides a sentinel site to understand Casco Bay's coastal systems and the impact that settlement, development, and environmental change have had in the area. And we're pleased to have our friends from Channel 14 here to record this event. And for those who don't know him, John Goff grew up in Bath, and he's a longtime summer resident of Oars Island. A graduate of Brown University, he holds an MA in architecture from the University of Oregon. He's a recognized authority on historic preservation and design. And in retirement, John has launched a new endeavor producing and presenting original educational slideshows on significant but often overlooked Maine historical events and subjects. He's spoken to local audiences on artists in Harpswell, the history of Baxter Canning Company, and the area's steamboat history, which was just a couple of years ago. And tonight we're privileged to hear about his latest effort, the history of the interesting tide mills in Harpswell. So without further ado.
Thank you, Don. And I want to thank you all in advance for being guinea pigs, because this has never been seen before, this show. We don't know for a fact that it can be seen in 1 hour, but we're going to aim for that. And I start with the number 8 here, because 8 years ago, Maine lost one of its most valuable and talented artists, and her name was Dolph Ipcar. Some of you may know her. She was from Georgetown. She did a lot of work in the Bath, Georgetown area. This is one of her artworks. She did a lot of children's books and a lot of really colorful paintings of animals. And I start with this one because growing up in Winnegans, there was always a riddle about Winnegans. Why is it like a penny? And the answer is they both have 10 mills. A mill was 1/10 of a cent, and in Winnegans, they had 10 tide mills. Now, Harpswell doesn't have a riddle, so I figured tonight we should provide a riddle. So the riddle goes, how is historic Harpswell like a jubilant or giant giraffe? And the answer is they both have a long, long neck and lots of great spots. And that, in a nutshell, is what I want you to think about, which is the shape and the size of Harpswell. When you look at Harpswell, the whole western half of it basically is this long, prominent peninsula that goes down towards Basin Point. And the rest of the town is made up of lots and lots of islands, which are beautiful spots in themselves, and they also have the bays and more tiny islands, making even more spots. So that's the riddle. When you go look at the neck, as it's called over there, Harpswell's long, long neck, if you clock it from Schofield Cove down to Basin Point, it's 10.6 miles, which is really remarkable. Because I grew up in Bath, which calls itself the Long Reach, but our little Long Reach over there is only about half as long as your 10.6 miles. So I think and anciently, that neck was called Merricaneag Neck, named after an Indian canoe crossing up near the Schofield property. And then this quote, Merricaneag Neck, now Harpswell, comes from a 1777 deed I was looking at a couple of days ago. So they just switched the name now to Harpswell Neck, but the old name was Merricaneag Neck. But it's been a neck for many, many years. And a neck of land, of course, as you know, refers to a narrow strip of land that connects two larger land masses or extends from a larger landmass, often resembling the neck of a body. And that's where it comes from. So, if you ever meet a giraffe with a 10.6 mile long neck, you'll know that it comes from Harpswell. And if you ever see a sign like this on the highway, you know they had a long neck too, because this reads Giraffeton. Now, the Harpswell founders did not use the name Giraffeton when they laid it out. Instead, they named it Harpswell after a little English settlement in Lincolnshire. But I don't know much more about the Lincolnshire connection. So looking at now some of the islands in East Harpswell, Quahog Bay has the beautiful snow island at its center, and there's lots of coves you can see that go all around the edge of Quahog Bay. Two of these coves were used for tide mills in ancient times. So we will get into some of these places. And for those of you that don't know Harpswell too, it actually is accessed by two parallel highways, 123 on the west and 24 on the east. So this is called the Old Water-Powered Tide Mills of Harpswell, Maine. A reconsideration. I call it a reconsideration because Bud Warren and I spoke about Harpswell tide mills about 30 years ago for the Harpswell Historical Society, and now we've got new information. I also gave a talk on tide mills at the Orrs Island Library 10 years ago. So this is one of those themes we keep coming back to. You can't get tide mills out of your blood, as it were. And I'm really pleased to present to the Harpswell Heritage Land Trust because they've done amazing things. A little over 40 years, they have preserved 20 parcels of land throughout our town. And just amazing. The one that I happen to know and love the best is right next to our summer house. It's the Houghton Graves Park. And if you go into Houghton Graves Park, you'll find that it's really on the west side of Route 24, right near Lowell's Cove Road, just north of the Orrs Island Post Office. And it's a T-shaped piece of land that gets you into some meadows, some forests, and beautiful Beals Cove. Now, Beals Cove is one of those places that you may not know much about. But in 2018, as a consequence of the HHLT creating this park, people from like up to Lewiston came up with some photographic equipment and took this picture, which made it to the cover of Down East magazine in 2018. So people are starting to appreciate Beals Cove and appreciate Harpswell because of what the HHLT is doing. Now, if you walk around that cove, you'll find it's really gorgeous down there, and it's a tidal body of water. And up here in Maine, we get about 8 to 10 feet of tide typically each time the tide changes. Now, this cove and this access and this park was created, as Don said, for the natural resources. And as I've gone down there over the days, I've seen these guys. We've got some ospreys. We've got some deer that live along the edge of the cove. We've got baby lobsters. We've got hermit crabs. We've got a whole bunch of things down there that are recognizable. But we also have some things that I can't recognize. And one of them is this. This is at a narrows point in that cove, and I'm looking at the mud flats at low tide. And what it looks like is a stone wall in the mud. It's an alignment of smaller rocks, and there's also stone piles not far from it. And I don't know what it is, and I'm dying to find out. And one of the possibilities is, well, A, we ought to create a Beals Cove archaeology initiative to get that going and do more research. But also, it might be part of the early tidal energy use that happened here in Maine. Tide mills are one of the best kept secrets in history. They have been around for 300 plus years. The technology started in Ireland that dates back to 619 AD. It's a very simple technology, but it really helped our ancestors provide a lot of things. It's wrapped up with the history of farming, and tide mills also basically allowed the development and the sustainability of maritime commerce. So it's really an old coastal phenomenon, and there's a lot of ingenuity in how these tide mills were built and how they worked. And in a nutshell, it was something like this. The idea was if you had a cove, preferably with a narrows at it at some point, you could build a dam across the narrows. You could put a one-way gates in that valve, so it would only accept when the tide's coming in. And when the tide starts shifting out, those gates would automatically slam shut and lock the water in at the higher level. Now you wait a couple hours, tide keeps going out on the outside, and you have enough water difference in height and pressure. You run your contained water to run a water wheel and do some work. That's the basis of tidal energy, the way it was used, like 99% of the tide mills in the English and the American traditions. And you'll find in water power, there are two major traditions. There were river mills, which have gotten most of the press, and there were these tide mills. Now, the tide mills had a few weird things about them. One was you could only work under certain tide conditions. And as you know, the tide times change an hour later every day. It's the lunar cycle. So if you're going to run a tide mill regularly, you've got to start work at 9 p.m. tonight, 10 p.m. tomorrow, 11 p.m. the next day. You've got to work around those tide times. You have no choice. So that's a little discomforting for many people. But on the other side, river mills are prone to A, drought in summer months. You might get no rain at all. Your river might dry up. You can't mill when there's no water. And B, in springtime, when the melting happens of all the snows and everything, and freshets happen, you could lose your whole mill. And this often happened. You read the old records of Brunswick on the Androscoggin, and there were sawmills across that entire river back in the day, in the federal period, and they would lose them all. And come spring freshet, they had to rebuild. It was a horribly inefficient means of creating mills. So the other advantage of tide mills, though, is you were on a water highway. Back in the time of the great age of sail, all the waterfront was prime real estate, because you could have a boatyard there, a shipyard there, a port there, you could do trade there, and if you had a tide mill on the coast, you could have access to other visitors. It'd be kind of like setting up something on Route 1 today. It was major exposure. So this is the schooner Alert that leaves Bailey Island daily, and you got to imagine in your mind that all the ships back in the day looked like this, or were sloops, or were brigantines, or whatever. They were traditional tall ships, and a lot of them would carry barrels of flour, wooden barrels of flour. Why? You got to feed the crew. That's one thing. So this was kind of like a commercial entity. It's a sustainability substance, flour. And also it could be used for trade. So flour, meal, bran, all these gristmill products were used kind of as a currency. And a lot of them were shipped actually to Europe back in the day. It turns out that we think of the breadbasket of the US as being out in the Midwest right now, which it is. It started out, though, on the East Coast, and then a lot of the early tide mills on the East Coast exported their mill produce over to Europe. So back to that schooner, you'd have a barrel like that would be put up in a grist mill, and more often than not, it would be locally ground flour, and it might have the miller's name stamped on or stenciled on the top of it. And I like this one, Stover's Mills. I don't know if Harpswell had a Stover's Mills yet, but we're kind of looking for one. They may have had one. And then, so anytime you have beautiful baked bread, all your baked products, it had to have flour. So what makes this kind of interesting and difficult to research too is names change over time. And so north of here, if you are going north on Route 24 and you go across the Gurnett Bridge, you'll see Buttermilk Cove is over on your left, kind of behind the Gurnett Lobster Company. That Buttermilk Cove anciently was called Duck Cove. And I just learned a few months ago that there was a tidal sawmill and a tidal grist mill in there working in 1795, which is really quite interesting. We think it was near the Prince's Point Bridge, but we're not totally sure. North of that, again in Brunswick, is this beautiful property, Thomas Point Beach. Thomas Point Beach fronts, we say it fronts New Meadows River. Back in the day, they called that the Stevens River. Deeds will talk about the Stevens River. And if you talk to Bud Warren at all, you'll learn that this too was a tide milling center back in the day. There was a dam that went off where the beach is now, and there were grist mills and sawmills that worked all that enclosed water at one time. And a couple of years I went back exploring at low tide up in those mud flats, and I found some vertically cut boards that were cut in one of the sawmills. The boards were just left there in the mud. And there's also a part of the footings of that original mill are up there. But if you go to that, again, Thomas Point Beach, you'll see all around it there's some beautiful millstones. And that's because Harry Crooker and the Crooker family that developed it had a passionate interest in millstones. They used some of them like plaques for this one to advertise the Bluegrass Festival that was held there for many years. But for those of you that work stone, you may learn that some of the terminology for these old millstones goes back to very, very ancient times. For example, when you look at a millstone, it's said that the smooth part of the face is called the land, like a field, like this land. And the parallel grooves that were etched in the millstone were called furrows. Well, you may know the furrow typically is also the scratch in the ground into which a farmer was going to put crops when he's plowing his field. So there's a microcosm, macrocosm thing going on here where the millstones reflect the farmer's thinking of centuries past. Now this millstone is just south of the Gurnett Bridge on Crooker family property, and this design with the straight line segments would be considered a Roman dress. So it's an ancient design of millstone that goes back centuries. Furrow means trench in the earth made by a plow. And so here you go. When you look at that, can you imagine that actually maybe a field of land and you've got miniature draft horses dragging a plow across the face of it? That's the way they were sort of thinking of it when they laid these things out. It's kind of interesting. And nearby, again, just south of the Gurnett Bridge on Route 24 on Crooker family property is this beautiful millstone. Note that the furrows in this millstone are curved. Each one is curved. That's called a sickle dress millstone. And it's called sickle dress because the curve reflects the curve of the sickle that was used anciently for harvesting wheat and other grains. And the sickle itself, I've learned, goes back 10,000 years. The earliest tools used for harvesting grain in and around the Israel area today were made with these sickles that were wooden sickles that had flint-knapped flints for the sharp parts set into the wooden blades. So it was super sharp and easy to use. And this is what they do. They cut the wheat that way. And then later on, the sickle gives way to the scythe, which you guys probably are all familiar with. The scythe becomes very popular by the 19th century. And your notorious Grim Reaper image always comes from a man holding a scythe. He's reaping. But when you're cutting wheat specifically, you've got to first get the grain down, and then you've got to thrash it or thresh it. And thrashing or threshing referred to beating it with these things that were called flails. And that whole flailing process, the threshing process, goes back again centuries and centuries. And this is what a flail looked like. My family used to sell antiques up by the Gwinnett Bridge and over in Bath, and we used to occasionally get some regional Maine flails into the shop, and they're really quite interesting to look at. And so the thresher meaning to sort of whip and bash something. There is a shark called the thresher shark, I'm told, that does something very similar with his tail, and he uses the beating of the tail to herd fish to eat them. But the threshing happened either in a barn or in an open area outside, and they would use flails or animal power to thresh the wheat on the threshing floors. Later on, they'd use either horsepower or steam engines to do the hard threshing work. The steam engine is really quite interesting. Now, the last lecture we gave here a couple of years ago, we talked all about steamboats and steam power. But when you apply this technology now to farming, a couple of things happen. One of which is, when the steam engine comes in, they can get away from tide mills, having to have the mill on a water source, because you can now just hook it directly to a steam engine. So there's a mill in Brunswick on Cumberland Street by the railroad tracks that is this building, which I'm sure was a steam-powered gristmill back in the day. This is an 1881 photograph from Pachepska History Center. But the steam engine also gave you networks of railroads. This is an 1850 proposal for a transcontinental railroad system. And we find that what happens is if you're a tide mill owner, and by 1850 you've got access to all this rail across the country, you can now look at how much it costs for grain in other places and how much they're paying for flour in other places, and you can use the railroad to extend your milling operation. And they did that a lot. And as a consequence of the extending of the milling operations today, you've got a lot of winter wheat, shown in blue here, is grown in a lot of the Midwest states. So that the winter wheat comes in later, and it required a different milling technique using metal rollers. But the old way, the traditional way, was you use the power of the moon and its gravity upon the Earth's oceans and the spin of the Earth to give you tides, and you collect the tide water and you re-release it when you want it, and you use the power of that water power to run your mills. This is a millstone over on the other side of Harpswell. I photographed a couple of years ago. We believe this came from the Basin Cove mill over in South Harpswell. It's a massive piece of granite, and it's beautifully dressed. And so just imagine this massive, at least 1 ton weight stone being rotated like a pinwheel. And so it spins quickly. And the idea was you get these things spinning really quickly, and you get a miller to keep the faces sharp. So these are actually cutting blades that he's etched into the stone. And then what happens is you can run the grain into those 2 stones that are almost touching, and you pulverize the grain. You cut the grain, it pulverizes the grain, it grinds the grain. We call it grinding, but it's not actually an abrasive grinding as much as it's a cutting. And so as for the grain, typically it would be either Indian corn or regular corn, maize, the yellow kernel in the middle, which you all know about. And then the other common grains here in the Northeast were barley, oats, rye, and wheat. And so any of these cereal grains would have been ground in a grist mill back in the day. And once you ground it, whatever grain it was the first time, you got what's called meal. And then once you've got meal, it's still got a little impurities in it and all, and you might want it kind of further be refined to create white flour. So extra bolting or sifting has to happen to give you flour, middlings, or bran from the meal. So that's the basic process. A mill itself is considered to be a building equipped with machinery for grinding grain into flour. Over the years, it's also come to mean a building fitted with machinery for doing other manufacturing processes. So what really happened here is the grist mills are developed first in the English tradition. And the English were really against the idea of automated sawmills because they didn't want to lose work for their manual sawyers who were working in pit saws. So the sawmill really develops in America later on in the colonial period. And then after that, you find that the technology of water power, here's the English flag in the 1630s, so they were really against sawmills back in the day. But once you know how to use the water power and you've got these different water wheels doing work, you can, later on in the 1800s, you can do textile mills like the Cabot Mill in Brunswick, you can do the paper production like the paper mill in Possum. So it opens a lot of doors. Now in England, there's a group called the Mills Archive Trust, which I kind of want to pump here a little bit. Here's their logo. They give equal time to both windmills and water mills, categorically. And they are trying to preserve lots of images relating to the workplaces of mills from whatever period. And I got an email from this woman who worked at Maple Durham Water Mill on the Thames River. That's the old water mill. The mill goes back to the 15th century. And this shows her working some ropes upstairs in that mill in the 1980s. And this kind of photograph, this information is so rare to see preserved anywhere. The English are light years ahead of us in terms of that preservation. We typically only are lucky to find a picture of a tide mill anywhere. We don't have any pictures that I've ever seen of workers in a tide mill. But this little postcard pops up. This shows 3 old landmarks, it says, in Phippsburg. This is the one on the right is the little grist mill, a tiny little grist mill that worked kind of near Center Pond in the Parker Head area of Phippsburg. And you see how small that is. That's really all you need if you want a tidal grist mill to just mill some grain and just make some flour. You don't need a lot. You can have one run of stones on a floor there, and maybe you don't even do any bolting or sifting, and maybe it's just there to grind corn into cornmeal or make feed for animals. That's really all you need is a small operation. But we find over the years that in Harpswell specifically, they had much bigger visions. They built much bigger, at least over at the basin. Now Harpswell also has, I gotta show this, an immensely long fishing tradition. It's been a fishing town for centuries and centuries. The Indians, of course, had dugout canoes. We've spoken about that at some of our other lectures. You've got people today that are catching things like this right offshore, and fishing is big business. What's interesting about fishing is one of the earliest fishing implements is the spear, or the eel spear, or the fishing spear that looks like this. It's a 3-part spear. And Poseidon, the Greeks, and Neptune with the Romans both carried a trident, which is basically the same implement. And if you look at Harpswell from space, which I've not done, but if you look at the neck, what you really have is an elongated linear element that ends in a tripod ending. So you could think of it, and it has been thought of, that this is nothing more than a large spear or a trident or a fork. And so there you go. There's the 3 times of South Harpswell. And what's interesting about this is when you go into the old deeds, you find they actually made reference to some of these things. For example, nowadays, you've got Basin Point, you've got Ash Point, you've got Potts's Point over there are 3 landmarks on the end of Harpswell. And there's Potts's Point looking from the south. So Basin, Ash, Potts, for those of you that need some simple letters to help you remember things, that's how you do that. That's how you get around. We think of those as points. They're like pointing fingers. They're points of land. That's what we think. Back in the day, they thought they were prongs on a fork. And you can find this when you go to the old deeds. I ran across a 1777 deed, which was from a John Winthrop to Jacob Bailey. And Winthrops are giving to Jacob Bailey a certain lot of land lying upon one of the prongs of Merrimack Neck, now called Harpswell, in the county of Cumberland, called Basin Point, which previously was the estate of the Honorable Adam Winthrop of Boston. And there's about 40 acres on the end of Basin Point. It was called Basin Point, and it was one of the prongs of Merrimack Neck. I've also seen the prongs of Merrimack Neck referenced in other deeds from the 18th century, from the Revolutionary War period. So it's really interesting that they had that idea of the land. Prongs and forks back in the day also referred to a 3-tined hay fork, a pitchfork, and also a dinner fork. The fork that we all use for dining was 3 prongs through the Civil War period and didn't get the 4th time till later. So it's an old way of thinking about forks and tridents. And this fellow here, I've learned, is the John Winthrop who deeded that land to Jacob Bailey. This guy was actually a great-great-grandson of the John Winthrop, who is this fellow, who founded Boston, Massachusetts in 1630, coming over on the Arbella with the Arbella fleet. So this fellow, John Winthrop, deeds land, 40 acres, to Jacob Bailey. Now we don't know when the Winthrops got their property there to deed it away. We don't know when they got it. It predates the deeds that exist for Cumberland County. It's possible they might have got it in the 17th century and got passed down as a cherished property. We don't know. And the other question is, why were they, who were based in Boston, what were they doing right up here? What were they doing in Harpswell? What we do know is that the Winthrops were highly influential in a lot of things. And one of the younger Winthrops, John Winthrop Jr., played a key role in establishing early ironworks in Massachusetts in the 17th century, the Braintree Works. So that's kind of interesting. And the possibility is raised that the Winthrops might have been scouting this out for future tidal energy use, because they recognized it as a basin and they labeled it a basin point by 1777. If there was envisioned some sort of future tidal use, we don't know of any relics or remnants, anything surviving from that early first phase. But we do know that the biggest tidal grist mill in Harpswell and probably in Maine was built there in 1867. And it was built there near the narrows of Basin Cove, north of Basin Point. The person getting record for being the owner and developer of it was the George W. True and Company, which was then based in Portland. True, born in 1823, was a native of Montville, Maine, which is east of Augusta. And he was the youngest of three sons, born to Moses and Lois Knowles True. He carried Willard as his middle name, possibly inspired by Solomon Willard of Boston, who was the designer of the Bunker Hill Monument. All three True boys appear to have thought big, and his two older brothers, John and Ira, ended up leaving Maine for Ohio and California. So here's the slice of showing the family as a whole of all the Trues. George was right down here on the right. He was the youngest boy, but he had a number of sisters and he had two brothers. Now, it's interesting, we talked about the steam power and how that might change things if you're a milling guy. It turns out Mr. True started off involved with tide mills in Portland and also in what's now Falmouth. And yet by the 1850s, we find he goes out to Ohio and Minnesota. And what is he doing out there? He's bringing mills and mill machinery with him to bring mills to the frontier once you've got steam engines. So here's a quote from Minnesota talking about how G.W. True and Mr. Potwin brought a sawmill here from Ohio, and then the mill came in True's name. It was set up west of the Winship House. Machinery for a grist mill was also brought here, although this was never set up. So True is looking at milling big time on kind of a continental scale by the 1850s. He loses his first wife out in Minnesota, and she's buried out there. This is her grave. He remarries and he comes back, keeps things sort of in Maine. He's thinking big, like the Bunker Hill Monument. And if you look at the 1857 map of Harpswell, which can be found here, the J. Chase map, C-H-A-C-E, you will find, and this is available on the internet, that the Baileys, by 1857, still held on to Basin Point. You see the J. Bailey and another Bailey right next to him occupying Basin Point. But in the other land here on the east, you've got the Bibbers owning a lot of land and also the Curtises. Now, the Bibbers were a prominent early Harpswell family all out on Haskell's Island and then also here in South Harpswell. And they were married, or some of them were married, with the Stover family. There was an Isaac Stover who was a shipwright, and he was married into the Bibbers. So the Bibber-Stover family as a whole was very influential in setting up the Basin Cove Tide Mill. George True's gravestone survives in the Evergreen Cemetery in Portland, and this is showing where he and his second wife, Ann Barker, were buried. This is not George W. True. This is, in fact, Joshua L. Chamberlain. But I put it in here as a placeholder because this shows Chamberlain when he was president of Bowdoin about 1870. And I just learned a couple days ago that True also attended Bowdoin and was a non-matriculating member of the class of 1845, and that Special Collections has some papers relating to him. So I'm itching to get up there and see what they have. But he was a very well-educated man, like Chamberlain, and he had these Bowdoin connections, which is, I think, fascinating. But as you all know, the Civil War took up America's attention between 1861 and 1865, so if there are any ideas of developing a tide mill here in Harpswell, it had to happen after that. And what you find is by 1866, the very next year, this appears in some state records for Maine. 7 people from South Harpswell, David Stover, David Weber, Jacob Bailey, Norton Stover, Joseph Lawson, Charles Bibber, Moses Bailey, they are all authorized to work together to set up a dam in South Harpswell. And what is the dam being built for? To erect wharves, mills, and other manufactories. So the other manufactories is a kind of interesting phrase that could have meant something like an ironworks or another major factory of some sort. Also, what's happening at the same time in 1866, on July 4th, a lot of Portland burns up in the Great Fire. So Portland is trying to rebuild, And because True was based in Portland, you could sort of see this as a Portland push to get things going in Harpswell very quickly. I put the Canada flag in here because I think there might have also been a vision to try to capture Canadian profits. The railroad connection between Portland and Canada was strong in the 1850s. And if you had a huge tide mill doing a huge amount of business producing flour in Harpswell, you could sell it to Canadians by railroad. Now, when you look at archaeology, this fellow, Tom Mackerlin from Ireland, is the one who I met in the 1990s, and he's the one who found and excavated this beautiful little tide mill in Nendrum, Ireland. And this is an early medieval tide mill. You see it's got two runs or two pairs of millstones inside run by two horizontal water wheels down below. And that's the basic technology you need for running a simple little mill that's just going to grind your flour and bran. Harpswell, the 1867 mill, was actually one of the last tide mills, if not the last tide mill built in this town. 1,200 years after Nendrum, they were looking at other things. They were thinking much bigger than that. What they developed was a dam, which was going to be a road support, so that there was a whole circular road going all around the basin, which they called the Mill Pond Basin. Down below the dam, they had the G.W. True & Company Casco Bay grist mill. That's the main building we're going to see more of. They also had a secondary building up just north of that, and I don't know if that was an office building or a warehouse or what, I'm not sure. But by the 1860s, you find here in Maine, the Greek Revival, which was so popular for decades, is starting to give way to the Italianate style. And you started getting sort of more vertical, attenuated Greek Revival buildings like this. And the tide mill, which is built, is a very tall, late Greek Revival building. This is the best known postcard of the mill that was built over there at the Basin Cove. And this is the south front of that mill. We're looking north. And if you kind of go around it, you can see the south side is also shown in one of Joyce Bibber's books about Harpswell. And this is all after the mill ceased running in the 1880s. And the proportions of the mill are very nice. I don't know who designed it. I'm going to throw it out there that maybe this fellow designed it. Francis Fassett, who was one of Portland's great architects, the one whom John Calvin Stevens trained from. Fassett designed the old Baxter Library building on Congress Street in Portland. There's something really nice and simple about the proportions of this mill that make me think Fassett might have designed it. I don't know that for a fact, but when you look at these pictures, you can see it's symmetrical, it's nicely proportioned, it's sturdily built, and even though these photos are a little fuzzy through blowing up, what's interesting about it is the height, too. It's higher than most grist mills known, because most grist mills are either 1 story or 1.5, or at most 2.5 stories. This was 3.5 stories. So we don't really know what the extra floor was for, but the guess is that maybe it had tub wheels, at least one tub wheel or water wheel down below, and maybe it had 2 floors of milling, which is why they had identical doors on the east side, and then maybe a bolting floor on the 3rd floor, and then the grain storage we know was up in the attic, and that's typically what was done. The whole theory is grain is very heavy, and you bring it in by ship or however you're going to do it. In this case, it was by ship, and you would use grain elevators or hoists to bring it way up to the top, and then you'd let gravity sort of let it filter back down through your millstones and stuff. So you use gravity. Once you've got the grain up there, gravity would do the rest of the moving of that stuff down on the lower floors. We have this wonderful picture here which shows a schooner pulling up to the south side of the mill. There's a guy standing on the stern of the schooner, and there's another fellow sort of standing on a platform coming off the mill itself. I think what they're doing here is they're getting ready to unload the grain, and so they're going to set up this thing, which was a grain elevator. It was kind of like a water wheel built of metal buckets, usually on a canvas strap, and the thing would go around by Waterpower, and it would basically lift the grain out of the ship and just dump it in the top of the mill. So that's how these guys were getting the corn or the grain out of the ships and into the top floor of that grist mill. And then these other photos show the north side of the mill, and you can see what's left of the dam. The dam, in this case, was actually a timber frame structure, which is highly unusual. Most mill dams are solid stone or 2 solid stone walls with dirt infill. You need something substantive. I'm amazed that they could hold the weight of all that water with just some sort of a wood wall against a timber frame structure, but they apparently did before storms and stuff took it out. But the curious thing is, if you go to the old tide mill site down in Falmouth, they had a similar thing there with wooden dams. And I guess the reason was it could be built much more economically if you could make it last. So it was much cheaper to build a wood one. But they also had, as I said, a road that went across the top of this dam. So it was a wonderful way to drive around Harpswell too. In 1869, 2 years after the mill was built, a fellow named Walter Wells comes to Maine and he produces Waterpowers of Maine, a hydrographic survey. And this is his description of the Casco Bay Mills, or the Basin Cove Mill. And he gets the length of the dam, and he gets the height of the water, and the kind of turbine it had, and there's some interesting little phrases in here. He's talking about vessels of 8,000 bushels capacity discharged directly into the mill. We don't have a picture of a Ryder turbine, but we know a 50 horsepower Ryder turbine was used. It probably looks something like this, a cast iron cylindrical object that basically is a horizontal water wheel, and this would be underneath the mill, and water would be directed to hit the blades and spin it, and then they would use that to run everything. When you look at the language in this, though, what's interesting, they talk about the building will accommodate 3 water wheels and 6 runs of stone. Well, a run of stones is 2 millstones, one on the lower and one on the upper. So when you got 6 runs of stones in a mill, you've actually got 12 millstones. So for moving parts in this mill, we can extrapolate that there would have been 12 large granite millstones paired up. So you had 6 runs of 12. They wouldn't have had all different patterns like this, but this is just a nice picture showing 12 millstones. And when you do the math on that, that actually comes out to be about 12 tons of large and heavy granite discs. And the top ones are spinning furiously fast at typically 120 rotations per minute, RPM, 120 RPMs. So, and they also talked about how the site itself at full development could be a 600 horsepower facility. So if you do the math on that one, it looks like they were actually thinking that this Basin Cove grist mill would be the first foot in the door, so to speak. And if it really worked, they could put 11 other mills on that same dam and basically create a mill city here in Harpswell, the way they also did the mills in Winnegans, the mills on Parker Head, the mills in Boston. So this whole idea of thinking really big and trying to create like an industrial city, I'm pretty sure that's what they had in mind. And towards that effort, we know for a fact that the George W. True and Company people used Clark Barker, who I believe was a brother-in-law of George True's, and he was able to put pressure on the state to build the Halfway Rock Lighthouse out there on Halfway Rock. The reason that lighthouse was built was to be a navigational beacon to help these large ships coming up from Maryland and Mid-Atlantic find this mill without hitting the rocks. So that's kind of interesting. And what we do know also is that by the 1870s, True was rewarded with a position of being surveyor of customs in Portland. So he must have been supervising the whole custom house facility. And he uses this as and his industrial expertise as a stepping stone. And in 1891, he actually becomes mayor of the city of Portland. So we haven't got a picture of him yet. I'm dying to find a picture of this guy. But he was a major figure, and he needs more attention. He did involve Clark Barker as a partner in the mill, and also a fellow named Spring, Samuel Spring. So there's a lot of people to research more. Back in 2007, the Tide Mill Institute gave a presentation on this. Todd Greisett gave a wonderful presentation. I was going to do it, but I came down with a stroke at that time. So Todd took over for me, and I'm really grateful that Todd did that. But that's your first and major tide mill here in Harpswell. And as you know, the Wright brothers took off in 1903. 3 years later was 1906. In 1906, this woman, Clara Louise Burnham, with deep Bailey Island roots, she was literally a root, Clara Louise Burnham, wrote a book called The Opened Shutters, and that used the Basin Cove Tide Mill on its cover and for its inspiration. So eventually what happens is the year after her book comes out in 06, in November of 07, is a freak high storm in the winter here, and it blows the tide mill off its foundations, and it just drops it in the navigation channel over there. And then people have to be employed to take it all apart. And they reused the lumber to build several gambrel roof buildings over there in South Harpswell. But these photographs were taken showing the mill in one of its last days, and also after it's been taken down, and there's a huge cast iron gear wheel in the foreground. I don't yet know how that was used in the mill. But anyway, I'd like to see us, I've been thinking for a couple of years, it would be fun to create a Friends of the Tide Mill Landing Park. Because Harpswell has a brand new Tide Mill Landing Park over there, and if we had a friends group, we could help maybe keep the brochures available, improve the brochures, maybe even do something like build a small model of the mill, whatever. Back to the Crookers for a second. Harry Crooker, I'm told by Bud Warren that Harry Crooker, the reason he got into millstones was as he's putting his highways through and causeways through, he kept running into millstones on these sites because they were all tide mill sites, and he just started collecting the millstones. By the 1960s, he had about 40 old millstones. The other day, I was up on some of the Crooker property closer to the Androscoggin River and saw this. It's a broken millstone, but it's a beautiful one. You can see the The way the lines are tooled into the granite is really wonderful. This is the tool that the millwright would have used to do that. This is a miller's bill or a miller's pick. And every millstone, kind of like a face, has eyes in it. The eye of the millstone is the hollow part in the middle through which the grain is poured. This is a photograph looking down at a Brooker millstone, and you can see there's a bent iron piece that comes up through the eye. That bent iron piece, looking also like this, is called a rind, R-H-Y-N-D, or a balance rind. And what happens is that just holds the top millstone, so it literally is above the lower one. It's not touching the lower one, but it's in perfect balance, kind of like how you get your tires aligned at Lee's Tire, you know, and they put lead weights and stuff. This would be lead weighted, balanced just perfectly, so that when it starts spinning, it's going to spin in precise horizontal direction and not hit the lower millstone. And then within that, within the eye and above the rind, you found other pieces of equipment were set up. There was a thing called the shoe, which basically was this inclined wood piece that would take all the grain down from a hopper or a funnel and direct it into the middle. And the pole going up through the shoe was called a damsel, apparently because it made a lot of racket, it made a lot of noise. I'm sorry to be sexist, but that's the way it was in the tradition. The damsel was always clacking, and it was the clacking of the damsel against the shoe that actually physically shook all the grain into the millstone pair. And then this whole hopper, this funnel-like thing on top, was held in place. It rested on a four-legged device that was called a horse, because like sawhorses, a horse is something with four legs. So this horse would hold the hopper above the eye of the millstone. There's a horse, four legs. There's a cross-section through the hopper and the horse and the damsel and everything. The hopper, it's an interesting word. I learned recently that, here you go, here's the miller pouring the grain into the hopper to get it all started. Hopper used to be a name for a dancer who hopped or leaped. And then later on it became these bins and grain mills because the grain would literally hop as it was poured in. I didn't know that, but that's kind of cool. So, to help you get that in mind, this is a panda bear doing a little pogo stick hopping. And every time you see a pair of millstones, like if you go down the Cundies Harbor Road and you find out where Harry Crooker and his men set up Millstone Road with a pair of millstones sitting on at the base, think about how originally this would have had a hopper over it, would have had a miller pouring grain into it. This was part and parcel. This was the heart of a tide mill operation. And in America, tide mills were typically built of heavy timber frame around all these machines. They were buildings built for manufacturing. There was a fellow named Alfred Eldon who wrote a wonderful article on the history of tide mills in New England that was printed in 1935 for the Old Time New England magazine. There's also a fellow from Woolwich named George Carlton who in the 1980s produced a book called Tide Mills of Maine and Beyond. I urge you to find these books if you're interested in the subject, because these are the only two books that I've really seen on the subject. Tide mills, for some crazy reason, were mostly overlooked. But if you go to, there's actually a website now for Tide Mill Institute, you'll find that we have these books scanned and available for download on the website. There were, we've learned over the years, many different types of tide mills. They did all sorts of things from grinding spices to grinding chocolate to making shingles to making snuff, all sorts of things. And they are endangered as a class of buildings in America today. There's only about a handful left. Most of them are in New York, on Long Island nowadays. I had a good opportunity in the 90s to help save this one in Quincy, Mass., the Souther Tide Mill, and I learned a lot about tide mills from that project. About the time that was happening, though, we lost Maine's last tide mill, which was the Perkins Mill in Kennebunkport, which was this beautiful little grist mill. And so that all went up in flames due to arson, and then the rebuilding got stalled by the neighborhood people. But precisely in the year 2005, for those of you that are good at Roman numbers, we did create the Tide Mill Institute with two people, with Bud Warren and also Earl Taylor and myself. So that we started in 2005. This is now our 20th anniversary year. I encourage you to check out our website. Here's a picture we took of most of the tide mill folks back in 2018, using the Winnegast mills as inspiration. Here's a list of all the members at that time. The group has grown a lot over the years, and I don't have a crystal ball. I can't predict the future, but I would like to see us do much more with tide mills in the future ahead. I think it correlates with an emphasis on sustainable and renewable energies, which we need to get to in this country. And furthermore, because Harpswell and Maine have such a rich record of these things, you could have a mini museum of tide mills. You could have also an edicule, a small miniature tide mill built somewhere as an educational prop. You might even create a Harpswell museum of multiple tide mills. That might be kind of fun. But at the very least, you could have a Harpswell Mill Adventures undertaking and go around to schools and stuff and make people aware of these things. I remember as a kid going to the Bath Marine Museum when it used to be called that, and they have some wonderful models like this. And I could see just using models like that would be wonderful to see what these tide mills looked like. We need a greater understanding of all the tide mills that worked around here. Each one had its own story. There was probably at least 40 tide mills in this greater mid-coast Maine region. Windmills, you know, you think about Don Quixote, and being quixotic is considered to be idealistic or romantic and fanciful. But when you look at a windmill, a lot of them had the same exact machinery and gearing. It was very practical. It was early technology, it was early engineering. They had the same runs of millstones. They had the same running rudder stones above the bedded bedstone. Ted Hazen was a master miller from Washington, D.C. I used to know him. This is one of his prized pictures showing a miller next to a hopper full of grain. I just love this picture. But Ted Hazen also produced this before he died. This is like an X-ray view of two millstones looking from above right before the grain is poured in. And you see what's happening here is the pattern on those stones is designed in such a way so that they're going to shear the grain that comes in. It's not just a grinding, it's a shearing. So there's actually a cutting of the grain like that. Cutting, cut, 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 cut. That's cut, and then it's by centrifugal force. It's brought to the edge of the stones and dropped down, and then it's contained. And then if you want flour, you bring it up to the upper level of a mill using one of these grain elevators, and you can blow it through some sifting bolters and stuff and get that. So these things were filled with mechanical equipment, and I just love them. They're very Rube Goldberg-esque. This is an undershot wheel. This is the kind of water wheel they used probably originally for most of the tide mills. And they still can be found on the Van Wyck Leffert tide mill on Long Island. And this beautiful little tide mill that survives down in Virginia, the Poplar Grove tide mill, has an undershot or a flutter wheel next to it, and that still is set up. The Southern Mill in Quincy that I worked on had one of these, which is an early horizontal water wheel, also called a tub wheel. And this, we're told, these tub wheels took over in most of the tide mills for New England north of Cape Cod because these were more resistant to freezing in the wintertime. So a miller could use these year-round and get some work done. And this is underneath the tide mill in Gloucester. You can see the massive vertical power shaft and more gearing, very primitive wooden gearing underneath the Hodgdon Annisquam tide mill. The machinery is no longer there, but the building is. This is a painting that Doug Bain of Orr's Island gave to me recently, which I just love. It shows a similar mechanical apparatus he saw in Aroustic in the 1960s, and he painted it. And that's exactly a vertical shaft and gearing from a tide mill run by a horizontal water wheel. So if you look at this thing, this is a silly picture, but it gives you a sense of that's about how fast water is hitting a horizontal water wheel. You need faster than that if you're going to grind grain. So what you do is you throw extra gearing in there. Now there's a 78 RPM record. That's pretty fast, but it's still not quite fast enough. So you throw more gearing in it, and eventually you get up to something like this, and those millstones are running at 120, and that's what you wanted to grind grain. So that was happening years ago all throughout Harpswell, and they also had mechanisms for adjusting the thickness of the grain, which they call using the rule of thumb to see the miller's thumb is the right consistency, and they would lift the stones apart if they needed to. They could separate the stones and sharpen them this way. That was done within a mill. Post, a beam, and a brace. Those would be used with a big iron screw to lift the heavy millstones apart so you could sharpen them. So that's a typical scene within the mill. This is a Diderot etching from the 1700s, and you see they're typically 2.5-story buildings. And this is a later American Oliver Evans mill proposal. A section again through the mill. You can see they're using the grain elevator to unload the grain from the ship. But usually they're 2.5 stories tall. As I said, Harpswell though had a 3.5-story grist mill in South Harpswell that was kind of amazing. Now, we know for tide mills in Harpswell that there wasn't just that one tide mill. There were 5 well-known tide mills. So just like a hand has 5 fingers, we had in Harpswell, well, and you can see how the peacock can kind of display all these colors. We had 5 well-known tide mills. The basin down there on the lower left corresponds to your thumb. Your index finger would be where Mill Cove is, west of High Head. That was the Wilson Mill, it's the second mill. And then around the Quahog Bay, there were 3 additional tide mills we know of, north, east, and south. And if we kind of go through those, we can see that here's the west of High Head Mill. We now call that Mill Cove over there. Back in the day, that was actually just called part of Widgeon's Cove, and it was called the Widgeon Cove Tide Mill. Harry Crooker put these millstones across the new causeway to be a commemorative historical site, we have this one old photograph of that tide mill, and that's the only photo we have so far. The great thing about this photo, though, is you can see on the lower right how big a man was. And if you look closer, there's other people on the dam. So I'm told that the dam for this mill was actually in the middle of Mill Cove and not where the current causeway is. You know, you could make a model really easily out of recycled boxes. It would be fun to get kids to do a model of this thing. From tracing it, it started off in 1786 with these families that were involved, the Jordans, the Wilsons, the Bookers. And if you've ever seen Tom Hanks in the movie Castaway, and he falls in love with Wilson, the volleyball, Wilson. This is Wilson's mill, and I use this to kind of remind yourself. The Wilson name is strongly associated with that mill, although the Dunnings, who built the beautiful Dunning House next to the Ewing Narrows Bridge, they also, Andrew Dunning was involved in that mill, and so were the Gatchells, and the Gatchells were master millwrights from Brunswick. So that's the west of High Head Mill. Around Quahog Bay, on the north end of Quahog Bay, there is still a Mill Cove, and the brand new Anatondro Preserve that HHLT has just created across from the school has a trail that takes you down to Mill Cove. That's very exciting because here's their property line, and you can see how the pedestrian paths go right down to Mill Cove. Mill Cove was named for the fact that this early tide mill was there. We believe it was the Jones/Orr tide mill owned by those two families. There's a picture of it as a couple of summers ago. The dam is very visible down there. It's a bunch of small rocks. And this is a sketch I made just showing how we think the mill probably was and how it used the existing sort of peninsula there to be most of the dam. So it was a very efficient little tide mill. To the east of Quahog Bay was also the Purrington Mill, which we know from local histories was originally run by Nathaniel Purrington or Purrington, and then it was a grist mill at least. And it might have been a sawmill too. If you go to that site on the east side of Quahog Bay, this is what you see. And again, the dam is mostly there, and again, made with lots of smaller rocks. And in later years, the Purrington family came to include Stephen Purrington and his wife Mary, and their son John, all of whom were involved with tide mills in Harpswell. And the last of the major five was down here, and that's on Hen Cove, and that is also near HHLT property. This is the Ridley site, Ridley Mill. It was Mark Ridley was the first developer, we believe, and then later on Robert P. Ridley developed and ran the tide mill also. And in later years, he sold it to Simeon Hopkins. So the Hopkins family gets involved with that mill. But here's the HHLT plot plan for that. You can see they call it Little Ponds Preserve. And you see on their map, they show tidal Mill Pond is actually there in the preserve. So the Mill Pond survives, part of the dam survives. It was sort of the fifth of the best known early Harpswell tide mills. Here's the walking on the dam a couple of summers ago, and again, looking at the water and the views. These are beautiful sites. If you go to any of these tide mill sites, they're invariably gorgeous sites, and they just have wonderful stories to tell. So we know these are the five best known tide mill sites in Harpswell. Talking to Herrick Johnson, who's in our audience, thank you, Herrick. He told me, though, that he took a class of tide mill stuff from Bud Warren, and Bud Warren filled him in about most of these other sites, too. So we think there might be as many as 14 or 15 tide mill sites in Harpswell. There were apparently 3 that were developed over by the Ewing Narrows area, and then there were these other ones. For example, when I was researching the High Head Mill in Mill Cove there, I ran into people that they remembered there being another tide mill in Widgeon Cove proper, in the west side of Widgeon Cove. So there very well could have been another one over there that we don't know about. I ran across a deed reference to a mill privileged by the Schofields. And so I'm wondering if they might have had a tide mill working next to their shipyard. That would make sense. And Cundy's Harbor, I'm told that there was at least 2 tide mills in Cundy's Harbor, one which is north of an ice pond and one which the mill pond was adapted to a lobster pound. We get back to number 13, that's the rocks that I saw at the south end of Beals Cove on Orr's Island. And then 14 would be at Stover's. I ran across a deed reference to Stover's Pond. I don't know where the pond was. I'm really curious to know if the Stovers did get some sort of water power working on a tidal pond. And number 15, I learned about recently, is over on what's called the Long Reach here on Great Island. On the west side of Long Reach is a Hannah's Cove and a Hannah's Cove Road. You can sort of see it way over there on the far left. It's that little indent, and it connects to Henry's Creek. And so Henry's Creek and Hannah's Cove, this is what it looks like in a map view. And we're quite sure now that there was a tide mill working here at one time. We started taking the old names from the maps and running it through the deeds records, and boom, milling operation pops up in the deeds by one of the Purringtons in the 1830s. So this is probably looking at a site over there at the mouth of Hannah's Cove where there would have been a tidal grist mill, if not also a tidal shingle mill. So there's very little left to the visible eye these days, but Harpswell seems to be one of the tide millingest towns in all of New England. And part of that's due to all the abundant waterfronts and the coves and the lack of the waterfalls. And it was also next to other areas that had lots of tide mills like Phippsburg and Bath and Boothbay Harbor and Georgetown. So that's kind of where we are. What we have when you drive around Harpswell, you see these street signs: Tide Mill Cove Road, Grist Mill Lane. We've got a Tide Mill Landing. And if you go around the landing area where the Basin Cove was, you just get these gorgeous views. I still want to know exactly where the mill stood. I'd like to know exactly where the dam stood. I don't know that. This is a wonderful picture showing some fellows in a dory rowing up to the mill before it came down after the '07 calamity. Here's that schooner coming in again, unloading. So you may have heard about the phrase raising Cain. People raise Cain when they're creating mischief. Well, what they were doing in this photograph back there, we're pretty sure they were raising grain. They were ringing it up by the elevator, so there was a lot of raising grain here in Harpswell back in the day. This is a picture inside the old Slade Spice Mill in Revere, Mass. And this is how you'd start operations. The miller would get over, and there'd typically be this horizontal wheel. He would crank the wheel like a steering wheel, and that would open up. It would connect with a rack and pinion. So he'd put power to a little small pinion that would engage with this cast iron rack, like a rack and pinion steering system. And the leverage, the amount of mechanical advantage was such that he could lift this water gate like a guillotine. And as it lifted, the water would pour onto the water wheel, and the whole mill would start rumbling and go into operations. And that's what you had here in Harpswell back in the day. Last but not least, I am told that Stephen Etnier kept a stone millstone from the Basin Cove Mill in his 1948 house. I didn't ever really know Steve Etnier that well, but his paintings are beautiful, and his heritage was such that his grandfather was actually the developer of a hydro engineering works in York, PA. They had the largest hydraulic turbine works in the country. So he knew all about water powers, and you look at some of his paintings, they do look a little tide mill-ish, and they look like tide mill dams, and he's really haunted by ruins of things that aren't there anymore. And some Basin Cove paintings pop up, and this is a picture I took of looking across at Tide Mill Landing. Now compare this with one of the Steve Etnier paintings. I believe it's the exact same site, and he's just added a more busier foreground to show more things happening, that this is Tide Mill Cove. And this one also is called Tide Mill Cove. It's an Etnier painting, and again, it's got very much the same background, but he's making it kind of, the fishing station, the fishing. And this one is haunting. This one's called like Into the Sun. And I believe this is looking east at the Basin Cove Landing across where the grist mill was. And I think this is Etnier's efforts to make a haunting painting of the mill that isn't there anymore. And he did similar things when the Alco Cisco was lost. He did paintings like this that show the Alco Cisco sort of barely present and everything boarded up. So that's it. The last thing I am going to mention, though, is a couple of years ago, Jerry York here on Orr's Island very kindly shared with me this photograph, which I love. And he said it was a tide mill in Harpswell from 1875. This is where the picture was taken. And I don't know which tide mill it was. And the question is, which tide mill is it? So there's been some speculation on the internet about it. Jerry at one point thought it might be the Basin Cove Mill. And I can understand him thinking that because it's a similar massing. And so he also asked this. He says it's the same place as the old Basin Cove Mill. So it is very similar in massing, I'll grant you that. But when you blow up the old picture that he has, and you look at what's really going on, I believe what you've got in the foreground here, there's a ladder coming down from this building. See, and then a ladder are typically rungs are about 2 feet apart. So if that's a ladder coming down from the first floor, then that would have been no more than probably 8 feet per floor. So you're looking at most a 2-story, 2.5-story grist mill. So my guess is actually from that and other factors that it's probably a different tide mill. It's probably one of a dozen or so tide mills that we don't have any pictures of at all. So it's very exciting to get a new picture. And on that last note, we are looking for more pictures. If you have any pictures, please let us know. We'll come to your house. We'll take copies of them. We'll credit you. We'd like to build up this knowledge base so that it'll help more people. Thank you very much. That's it. I want to thank the Harpswell Historical Society and also the Prescott History Center and Bowdoin College, of course, and the Harpswell Heritage Land Trust and Conyers Harbor Library for making this possible. This is an aerial photograph of one of the Conyers Harbor old tide mill ponds, and this is a picture looking across the dam on that. And you see that it's a double stone wall with dirt infill, and that was the much more common way of building a tide mill dam. So that's it. Our ship is going out to sea now, so thank you very much.